There's a moment in every toxic dynamic when something shifts, when the person who's been giving everything suddenly stops. And what happens next reveals the true psychological architecture of narcissistic dependence. What I'm about to share will fundamentally change how you understand these relationships and, more importantly, how you protect yourself within them. In my years studying Jungian psychology and observing these patterns, I've witnessed a phenomenon that most people never get to see clearly. It's the moment when an empath, someone who's been unconsciously feeding a narcissist's psychological needs, finally withdraws their energy. The result isn't what most people expect. It's not relief or moving on. It's complete psychological destabilization of the narcissist. Jung understood that our psyches operate through what he called psychological complexes, autonomous clusters of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that can take over our conscious awareness. In narcissistic individuals, these complexes are particularly rigid and dependent on external validation for their very survival. The empath unknowingly becomes the primary source feeding these complexes. Let me paint you a picture of how this unfolds. I worked with someone whose partner had all the classic narcissistic traits: the grandiosity, the need for constant admiration, the inability to genuinely empathize. For years, this person had been the emotional supply, always trying to understand, always making excuses, always being the one to apologize first. Then something changed. Not dramatically, not with anger or confrontation, but with a quiet, internal shift. Here's what most people don't realize. The narcissist's entire psychological structure depends on having someone to project onto, someone to extract validation from, someone to blame when their internal world becomes too chaotic to manage. Jung called this projection, and in narcissistic dynamics, it's not just a defense mechanism, it's a survival strategy. The day this person stopped caring wasn't marked by a big fight or dramatic declaration. It was subtler. They stopped trying to fix the relationship. They stopped taking responsibility for their partner's emotions. They stopped being available for the constant need for reassurance and attention. Most significantly, they stopped believing the narratives their partner created about reality. What happened next was fascinating from a psychological perspective, though devastating to witness. The narcissist began what Jung would recognize as a psychological regression, a retreat to earlier, more primitive psychological states. Without their primary source of validation and projection, their carefully constructed sense of self began to crumble. Now here's where it gets really interesting from a Jungian standpoint. Jung believed that underneath our conscious personality lies what he called the shadow, all the parts of ourselves we've rejected or refused to acknowledge. For most people, healthy relationships provide a safe space to gradually integrate these shadow aspects, but narcissistic individuals have typically built their entire identity around rejecting and projecting their shadow onto others. When the empath stops caring, stops being available for projection, the narcissist is suddenly faced with their own unintegrated shadow material with nowhere to put it. This creates what Jung would call a psychological crisis, a confrontation with aspects of the self that the conscious mind cannot handle. I've observed this pattern play out in 3 distinct phases, each revealing deeper layers of the narcissistic psychological structure. What I'm about to walk you through will probably feel eerily familiar if you've lived through this dynamic. The first phase is what I call the escalation phase. When the narcissist realizes their usual tactics aren't working, they don't back down, they intensify. This isn't conscious manipulation, though it appears that way. It's a psychological panic response. Their entire sense of self is built on maintaining control over their primary source of validation. Jung understood that when our psychological defenses are threatened, we don't become more flexible, we become more rigid. During this phase, you'll see behaviors that seem almost desperate. Love bombing mixed with harsh criticism, promises of change alternating with blame and accusations, attempts to recreate the trauma bonds that kept the relationship dysfunctional. What's really happening is that their psyche is cycling through every defense mechanism it knows, trying to re-establish the dynamic that kept their internal world stable. Between you and me, this is where most empaths get pulled back in. The intensity can feel like passion, like finally breaking through to the real person underneath. But Jung would caution us to understand this differently. This isn't authentic vulnerability, it's psychological desperation. The escalation typically follows a predictable pattern that Jung would recognize as the activation of what he called autonomous complexes. First comes the denial phase. The narcissist might act as if nothing has changed, continuing to make demands and expecting the same level of attention and accommodation. When this doesn't work, they move into bargaining mode, making grand gestures and promises that they've never followed through on before. What's particularly insidious about this phase is how convincing it can be. The narcissist might suddenly become everything the empath always hoped they could be: attentive, apologetic, seemingly self-aware. They might acknowledge past mistakes, promise therapy, even appear to take genuine responsibility. But Jung taught us to look at behavior patterns over time, not isolated incidents of apparent growth. Here's what I want you to understand about this temporary transformation. It's not genuine psychological development. It's what Jung might call a psychological compensation, an extreme swing in the opposite direction to maintain psychological balance. The narcissist hasn't suddenly developed empathy or self-awareness. They've simply recognized that their usual tactics aren't working and have activated different aspects of their personality to achieve the same goal: regaining control over their primary source of validation. The psychological machinery behind this escalation is fascinating when viewed through Jung's lens. The narcissist's psyche operates like a complex system of interconnected defenses, each one designed to protect the core vulnerability that lies at the center of their psychological structure. When one defense fails, the system automatically activates backup defenses, often in increasingly dramatic ways. During this phase, you might witness what Jung would call the activation of different persona masks. The narcissist cycles through various versions of themselves: the victim who needs rescuing, the lover who promises eternal devotion, the reformed person who has finally seen the light, the wounded child who just needs understanding. Each mask is deployed strategically, testing which one will successfully re-engage the empath's caretaking instincts. What makes this particularly manipulative is that each mask contains elements of truth. The narcissist genuinely feels like a victim when their supply is threatened. They genuinely experience something like love when their validation source is restored. They genuinely believe in their capacity for change when it serves their immediate needs. This partial authenticity makes their appeals incredibly compelling and difficult to resist. The second phase is the devaluation and smear campaign phase. When escalation doesn't work, the narcissistic psyche shifts to what Jung would recognize as a splitting defense, the inability to hold contradictory feelings about the same person. If the empath can't be the all-good source of validation, they must become the all-bad source of blame. This phase reveals something crucial about narcissistic psychology that Jung identified in his work on psychological projection. The narcissist begins attributing all their internal chaos, all their uncomfortable feelings, all their sense of instability to the empath who withdrew. In their psychological reality, they're not struggling because they've lost their coping mechanism. They're struggling because this person is somehow actively harming them by not being available. What makes this particularly insidious is that narcissistic individuals often have a remarkable ability to recruit others into their psychological narrative. They can present their version of events so convincingly that mutual friends, family members, even therapists can get pulled into believing the empath is the problem. Jung warned about this kind of psychological contagion, how powerful personalities can impose their psychological reality on others. During this phase, the narcissist becomes what Jung might call a master of psychological manipulation, though they may not be consciously aware of what they're doing. They'll share carefully curated stories about the relationship, positioning themselves as the victim of an unfeeling, cruel partner who abandoned them in their time of need. They'll focus on the empath's decision to withdraw care as evidence of heartlessness, while conveniently omitting the years of psychological abuse that led to that decision. I want you to understand something important here. If you're the empath in this scenario, the smear campaign isn't really about you. It's a psychological necessity for the narcissist. Their psyche cannot tolerate the idea that their suffering is internal and self-created. Someone external must be responsible, and since you withdrew your support, you become the perfect candidate for carrying their projected shadow. This is where Jung's understanding of projection becomes crucial. The narcissist isn't just lying about you to others. In their psychological reality, these projections feel completely true. They genuinely believe that you are the source of their pain, that you are cruel and unfeeling, that you have somehow wronged them by prioritizing your own psychological well-being. This makes them incredibly convincing to others because they're not consciously deceiving. They're sharing their subjective psychological reality. The smear campaign serves multiple psychological functions for the narcissist. First, it provides external validation for their victim narrative, recruiting others to confirm that they are indeed wronged and deserving of sympathy. Second, it attempts to isolate the empath, cutting off their support systems and potentially forcing them back into the relationship out of social pressure or loneliness. Third, it allows the narcissist to avoid taking any responsibility for the relationship's demise by placing all blame on the other person. What's particularly devastating about this phase is how it can affect the empath's sense of reality. After years of being gaslit and manipulated, many empaths already struggle with self-doubt. When mutual friends start questioning their decision, or when they see their reputation being destroyed by someone they once loved, it can trigger profound psychological distress. Jung understood this as a form of psychological warfare that attacks the very foundation of one's sense of self. The smear campaign often follows predictable patterns that reveal the narcissist's psychological state. They might claim the empath was never truly loving, rewriting the entire history of the relationship to support their current narrative. They might accuse the empath of having ulterior motives, projecting their own manipulative tendencies onto the other person. They might present themselves as having been the perfect partner who tried everything to make the relationship work, positioning the empath as impossible to please. What's particularly insidious is how the narcissist uses partial truths to make their narrative more convincing. Yes, the empath might have withdrawn emotionally toward the end of the relationship. Yes, they might have become less patient or understanding. Yes, they might have seemed cold or distant, but these behaviors are presented without context, without acknowledging the years of emotional abuse that led to this protective withdrawal. The third phase is what I find most psychologically revealing, the collapse phase. This is when the narcissist's psychological defenses finally become unsustainable. Without their primary source of validation and projection, and without the ability to successfully blame the empath for their internal state, they're left facing the very psychological material they've spent their entire life avoiding. Jung believed that such psychological crises, while painful, could potentially be transformative. He called this process individuation, the gradual integration of all aspects of the personality into a more whole, authentic self. However, for this to happen, the individual must be willing to face their shadow, to take responsibility for their projections, to develop genuine empathy and self-awareness. The collapse phase often manifests in ways that can be shocking to witness. The narcissist might experience what appears to be a complete personality breakdown. The confident, grandiose facade crumbles, revealing a frightened, angry, sometimes suicidal individual underneath. They might engage in increasingly erratic behavior, make threats against themselves or others, or fall into deep depression. This phase can be particularly confusing for empaths because it might seem like the narcissist is finally showing vulnerability, finally breaking down the walls they've built around their emotions. The temptation to return and help can be overwhelming, especially when the narcissist appears to be in genuine distress or danger. Here's what I've learned from observing this pattern repeatedly. The collapse phase, while appearing to be authentic vulnerability, is often another form of manipulation, though the narcissist may not be consciously aware of this. Jung would understand this as the activation of what he called the wounded child archetype, a powerful psychological force that can evoke deep sympathy and caretaking instincts in others. The collapse serves multiple functions for the narcissist's psyche. It's a final attempt to re-engage the empath's caretaking instincts by presenting themselves as helpless and in need of rescue. It's also a way of avoiding taking responsibility for their behavior by positioning themselves as the victim of their own psychological breakdown, rather than someone who needs to do serious work on themselves. Here's the difficult truth I've learned through years of studying these patterns. Most narcissistic individuals are not equipped for this level of psychological work. Instead of using the crisis as an opportunity for growth, they typically find new sources of validation, new people to project onto, new ways to avoid confronting their internal world. This is why the empath's decision to stop caring is so psychologically significant. It's not just ending a relationship, it's removing the narcissist's primary psychological coping mechanism. It forces a crisis that reveals the true nature of their psychological structure. But here's what's crucial to understand. The collapse phase, while appearing to be about the loss of the relationship, is actually about something much deeper. Jung would recognize this as the confrontation with what he called the wounded child archetype, the part of the psyche that holds our earliest traumas and unmet needs. For narcissistic individuals, this wounded child has been buried under layers of psychological defenses, grandiosity, and projection. When those defenses fail, when the external sources of validation are removed, the narcissist is suddenly face to face with the pain they've been running from their entire life. This might be childhood abuse, neglect, abandonment, or profound emotional invalidation. The narcissistic personality structure developed as a way to protect this wounded child from ever feeling that vulnerable again. The tragedy is that this protective structure, while serving its purpose in childhood, becomes a prison in adulthood. It prevents genuine intimacy, authentic self-expression, and real psychological growth. The collapse that follows the empath's withdrawal is actually the sound of this prison breaking down. But without the right support and willingness to do the work, most narcissistic individuals will simply build new prisons rather than face the freedom and responsibility that comes with authentic selfhood. During the collapse phase, you might witness behaviors that seem completely out of character for the narcissist. They might become clingy and dependent, begging for another chance. They might threaten self-harm or suicide to prevent abandonment. They might fall into deep depression or engage in self-destructive behaviors. While these responses are genuinely distressing to witness, it's important to understand them through a Jungian lens, as the psyche's attempt to avoid the real work of individuation. Now, if you're someone who's been in the empath role, you might be wondering about the psychological cost of withdrawing your care. Jung understood that healthy relationships involve what he called psychological reciprocity, a mutual exchange of energy, support, and growth. In narcissistic relationships, this reciprocity is absent. The empath gives and gives while receiving only intermittent reinforcement designed to keep them engaged. The decision to stop caring isn't really about becoming cold or uncaring as a person. It's about recognizing that your natural empathy has been weaponized against you and choosing psychological self-preservation. Jung would call this individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who others need you to be. Let me share something I've noticed about people who successfully withdraw from these dynamics. They don't typically do it with anger or revenge, though those feelings might be present. They do it with a kind of psychological clarity, a recognition that they cannot save someone who refuses to do their own psychological work. This withdrawal often comes after what Jung might call a moment of psychological awakening, a sudden recognition of the true nature of the dynamic. The empath realizes that their caring, their understanding, their constant forgiveness isn't helping the narcissist grow. It's enabling them to avoid growth. They recognize that their love has become a form of psychological codependence that's harmful to both parties. The process of stopping caring is often gradual and internal before it becomes visible externally. The empath begins to question the narratives they've been told about love, sacrifice, and relationships. They start to recognize their own patterns of self-abandonment and people-pleasing. They begin to understand that genuine love sometimes requires saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing others to face the consequences of their actions. This brings us to a crucial Jungian insight about codependent dynamics. Jung believed that we often stay in unhealthy relationships not just because we care about the other person, but because the relationship serves some unconscious psychological need in ourselves. For empaths, this might be the need to feel needed, the unconscious belief that love must be earned through service, or the psychological comfort of focusing on someone else's problems rather than facing their own. The empath's role in the narcissistic dynamic isn't just about giving, it's also about receiving something, even if that something is ultimately destructive. Many empaths discover that they've been using the relationship to avoid their own individuation process, their own shadow work, their own journey towards psychological wholeness. When an empath finally stops caring, they're often forced to confront uncomfortable questions about themselves. Why did I stay so long? What was I afraid would happen if I left? What parts of myself have I been neglecting while focusing on this person's needs? These questions can be painful, but Jung saw them as essential for psychological growth. The day the empath stops caring, therefore, represents not just the end of their enabling behavior, but often the beginning of their own individuation process. They begin to ask themselves hard questions. Why did I stay so long? What was I getting from this dynamic? What parts of myself have I neglected while focusing on this person's needs? This process of self-examination often reveals what Jung called the empath's own shadow material, the parts of themselves they've disowned or projected onto others. Many empaths discover that they've been so focused on being good, caring, and selfless that they've completely disconnected from their own needs, desires, and even their capacity for healthy anger. The withdrawal of care becomes an opportunity to reclaim these disowned parts of the self. The empath might need to learn how to set boundaries, how to say no, how to prioritize their own needs without guilt. They might need to explore their own capacity for selfishness, anger, or independence, qualities they may have labeled as bad and projected onto others. Jung understood that psychological health requires the integration of all aspects of the personality, including those we find uncomfortable or unacceptable. For empaths, this often means learning to value their own needs as much as others' needs, developing what could be called healthy selfishness, and accepting their right to prioritize their own well-being. The process of individuation for an empath often involves developing what Jung called a relationship with the self, the deeper, more authentic aspect of personality that exists beyond our social roles and people-pleasing patterns. This self knows its own worth, sets appropriate boundaries, and engages in relationships from a place of choice rather than compulsion. Here's what I want you to understand about the narcissist's breakdown in this scenario. It's not evidence that you were wrong to withdraw your care. It's evidence that the relationship was never sustainable in the first place. A healthy relationship doesn't collapse when one person starts setting boundaries or prioritizing their own psychological well-being. Jung taught us that true psychological health involves the ability to be alone with ourselves, to find internal sources of validation and meaning, to take responsibility for our own emotional states. Narcissistic individuals have typically never developed these capacities. Their breakdown when the empath withdraws reveals how psychologically dependent they were on external validation for their very sense of self. This doesn't mean we should feel no compassion for their suffering. Jung emphasized that everyone is dealing with psychological wounds and defenses developed early in life, but compassion doesn't require us to sacrifice our own psychological well-being to manage someone else's inability to face their internal world. I've seen empaths struggle with guilt over the narcissist's breakdown, wondering if they should return to help, if their withdrawal was somehow cruel or heartless. Jung would encourage us to distinguish between healthy compassion and what he might call psychological martyrdom. Healthy compassion recognizes that everyone must do their own psychological work. Psychological martyrdom believes that love means absorbing someone else's psychological pain to spare them the necessity of growth. The guilt that empaths feel when witnessing the narcissist's breakdown is often rooted in what Jung would recognize as a distorted understanding of love and responsibility. Many empaths have been conditioned to believe that love means never letting others suffer, never saying no, never prioritizing their own needs. This conditioning often stems from their own childhood experiences of having to manage a parent's emotions or earn love through caretaking. The most psychologically healthy response to a narcissist's breakdown is to maintain your boundaries while hoping they use the crisis as an opportunity for genuine self-reflection and growth. But this hope cannot come at the cost of your own psychological well-being. Understanding this dynamic through a Jungian lens reveals something profound about human psychology. We all have the capacity for both narcissistic and empathic traits. The difference lies in our willingness to develop self-awareness, to integrate our shadow material, to take responsibility for our projections, and to engage in genuine psychological reciprocity with others. Jung believed that we all carry within us what he called the narcissistic complex, the part of us that needs validation, recognition, and admiration. In healthy individuals, this complex is balanced by other aspects of the personality and doesn't dominate the entire psyche. In narcissistic individuals, this complex has taken over, crowding out empathy, self-reflection, and genuine connection. Similarly, we all have what might be called an empathic complex, the part of us that feels others' pain and wants to help. In healthy individuals, this empathy is balanced by self-care and appropriate boundaries. In codependent individuals, the empathic complex has become overdeveloped, leading to the neglect of one's own needs and the inability to allow others to face the consequences of their actions. The dynamic between the narcissist and the empath represents an unhealthy pairing of these complexes. The overdeveloped empathic complex feeding the overdeveloped narcissistic complex. When the empath withdraws, both individuals are forced to confront the imbalance in their psychological structure. For those who have been in the empath role, your journey doesn't end when you stop caring. It begins. You have the opportunity to explore what Jung called your own individuation process, developing a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on being needed by others, learning to receive as well as give, integrating the parts of yourself you might have neglected while focusing on someone else's needs. This process often involves what Jung called the integration of the shadow, acknowledging and accepting the parts of yourself you've disowned. For empaths, this might mean accepting their capacity for selfishness, anger, or indifference. It might mean learning to value their own needs as much as others' needs. It might mean developing what could be called healthy narcissism, appropriate love and care for oneself. The journey of individuation for an empath often involves learning to distinguish between genuine empathy and codependent caretaking. Genuine empathy allows us to feel with others while maintaining our own psychological boundaries. Codependent caretaking involves absorbing others' emotions and taking responsibility for their psychological states. Jung taught that genuine empathy actually requires a strong sense of self. We can only truly understand and connect with others when we have a clear understanding of our own psychological landscape. When empaths begin to develop this stronger sense of self, they often discover that their relationships become healthier and more authentic. The narcissist's breakdown, painful as it might be to witness, is ultimately their own psychological journey. Your role is not to fix it, manage it, or take responsibility for it. Your role is to honor your own psychological development and to engage in relationships that support mutual growth and authentic connection. I want to leave you with a framework that Jung might recognize, a way of understanding these dynamics that can help you navigate them more consciously. Think of psychological energy as a finite resource. In healthy relationships, this energy flows both ways, creating mutual nourishment and growth. In narcissistic relationships, the energy flows primarily in one direction, leaving the giver depleted while the receiver becomes psychologically dependent. The day the empath stops caring marks the end of this unsustainable energy drain. The narcissist's breakdown reveals how dependent they had become on this external source of psychological sustenance. Your withdrawal forces them to confront the question they've been avoiding. Who am I when no one is managing my internal world for me? This is the question that could lead to genuine psychological growth if they're willing to engage with it. But whether they do or not is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to your own individuation, your own psychological development, your own journey toward becoming an integrated, authentic human being. The breakdown you might witness isn't your failure. It's the natural consequence of an unsustainable psychological dynamic finally reaching its breaking point. And sometimes, as Jung understood, breaking points are exactly what we need to begin the real work of becoming who we're meant to be. If you've recognized yourself in this dynamic, whether as the empath finally setting boundaries or as someone wondering about your own narcissistic patterns, remember that psychological awareness is the first step toward change. Jung believed in the human capacity for transformation, but he also understood that this transformation requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to face the parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. The day the empath stops caring doesn't have to be an ending. It can be the beginning of two people finally taking responsibility for their own psychological development. But this can only happen when we stop using each other as escape mechanisms and start doing the real work of understanding ourselves. Your psychological well-being matters. Your individuation process matters. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to stop enabling psychological dependence and start modeling what healthy psychological independence looks like. The path forward involves developing what Jung called conscious relationships, connections based on mutual respect, individual wholeness, and genuine psychological reciprocity. These relationships don't require us to abandon our empathy, but they do require us to balance that empathy with healthy self-regard and appropriate boundaries.